Rainbow Magic number 18, Honey the Sweet Fairy, was changed into Honey the Candy Fairy for the United States release. Let's see what other changes they made. In the illustration, the sweet shop becomes the candy shop. In the opening poem, have they becomes they have. Jubilee becomes anniversary. All Fairyland becomes all of Fairyland. Shine your wand becomes pull out your wand. Press your dress becomes fanciest dress. HRH is removed from the fairy godmother's name. The title of Chapter 1 is changed from A Trip to the Sweet Shop to A Trip to the Candy Shop. The title of Chapter 5 is changed from Sweets Galore to Treats Galore. The numbering changes. The American edition starts on page 1. The British edition starts on page 9. Chapter 1. Lovely becomes beautiful. Had set lunch becomes had set the table for lunch. Aloud is removed from groaned aloud. From the shops becomes from town. Gran's toffees becomes toffees for Gran. This evening becomes tonight. Mum becomes mom. We'll go becomes we can go. Sweet shop becomes candy shop. I've always got becomes I always have. Sweet shop becomes candy store. Had met one summer holiday becomes had met when their families vacationed on Rainspell Island. Good friends becomes best friends. The pair of them becomes the girls. Sweet shop becomes candy store. From tomorrow becomes starting tomorrow. As becomes since. Plenty of becomes lots of. Free sweets up for grabs becomes free candy. Kirsty nudged Rachel at once becomes Kirsty nudged Rachel. Sweets becomes candy. Shared a secret becomes shared a special secret. Jubilee becomes anniversary. Wicked Jack Frost becomes Mean Jack Frost. For his own rival party becomes to throw his own party on the same day. Disrupt becomes ruin. Then, whenever becomes whenever. Snatch becomes steal. Outwit becomes outsmart. Had anything to do with it becomes had anything to say about it. Toffees becomes toffee. In the illustration, sweet shop becomes candy shop. Sweet shop becomes candy store. Into the high street becomes onto high street. Children becomes kids. Clustered outside becomes crowded outside. Drew nearer becomes came closer. Pulling a face becomes making a face. These sweeties taste funny becomes this candy tastes funny. Tiny shop becomes tiny store. Twined becomes twisted. Sweets becomes candy. Immediately becomes at once. Look her normal cheerful self becomes look as cheerful as she usually did. The sentence starting with it's my last day is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Sweets becomes candy. Chapter 2. Pineapple chunks becomes saltwater taffy. Their jar becomes its jar. Lying in the sun becomes left out in the sun. The sherbet was fizzing so fiercely it made everyone sneeze. Becomes the sour balls were so sour that no one would eat them. Pink sugar mice becomes chocolate mice in the text and the text in the illustration. Jelly babies becomes gingerbread men in the text and the text in the illustration. The sentence starting with Kirsty looked is split into two sentences before the word all. All with becomes they all. Jelly snakes becomes gummy worms. Wriggling crossly becomes slithering around. Hissing becomes hissing like snakes. Snakes becomes worms. The sentence starting with something weird is split into two sentences at the word as, which becomes just then. A low grumbling hum start up becomes a chorus of high-pitched squeaks come. A jar of stripy humbugs becomes a package of chocolate bunnies. It's got to be goblin mischief becomes it's got to be a goblin. Pineapple cubes becomes taffy. In dismay is removed from side in dismay. What's happened becomes what happened. The sweets becomes the chocolates. Hollow becomes hollow spot. Immediately is moved to after the word chocolate. The sentence starting with the girls exchanged is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Kirsty promptly peered down becomes Kirsty looked. Goblin's got becomes goblin has. Shop counter becomes store counter. Trail of chocolatey footprints becomes chocolate footprint trail. They seemed becomes it seemed. Shop becomes store. Wheel is removed. Wreaking havoc becomes making a mess. Rachel hissed becomes Rachel whispered. These spoiled sweets becomes this candy. I'll get some new ones becomes I'll have to get new candy. Cried Kirsty becomes Kirsty cried. Hurriedly becomes immediately. Becomes She stammered becomes she searched for words. You can't becomes you shouldn't. Fetch the sweets becomes get the candy. You like the look of becomes that looks good to you. Cautiously becomes carefully. Peeped becomes peeked. There were sweets becomes there was candy. Desperately is removed from a tiny fairy struggling desperately. Hang on becomes hold on. As a grinning goblin becomes and there was a grinning goblin. Fought becomes who was fighting. Sweet becomes candy. Chapter 3. At once is moved to the start of the sentence. Little sherbet becomes lemon drop. Swung madly to and fro becomes swung back and forth. We certainly will becomes of course we will. In the illustration, pear drops becomes lemon drops. In the illustration, cola cubes becomes sugar cubes. Sweets becomes candy. Gobstoppers becomes jawbreakers. Happily is removed from she exclaimed happily. Gobstoppers becomes jawbreakers. Sweets becomes candy. Yelped becomes yelled. Gobstopper becomes jawbreaker. All the breath was knocked out of her becomes the wind was knocked out of her. Gasped honey becomes honey gasped. In a sparkling shower becomes in a shower of sparkles. The tiny sweet-shaped sparkles becomes the magic dust that was shaped like tiny hard candies. Great becomes big. Now I've got becomes now that I've got. Striped candy cane becomes giant striped candy cane. Tee-hee becomes ha-ha. Gobstoppers becomes jawbreakers. He shouted as he fell over becomes he fell over. His pockets becomes the goblin's pockets. The sentence starting with all of the fairy is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Began vanishing becomes the dust started to vanish right. Gnarly is removed from gnarly green hand. Leapt up becomes stood up. Marched smartly becomes marched in time. Stripy canes becomes striped canes. Hurting becomes nudging. Protested the goblin becomes the goblin protested. The grumbling goblin was marched right out of the back door, out of the shop, by the dancing candy canes, becomes the dancing candy canes herded the grumbling goblin right out the back door of the store. That's got becomes that got. Smile slipped becomes smile dropped. Oh dear becomes oh no. Terrible mess becomes huge mess. Sweets all over the floor becomes all kinds of candy on the floor. Jars overturned becomes jars were turned over. Tidy becomes clean. Anxiously becomes nervously. It's going to take us ages becomes it's going to take forever. I could magic everything to rights becomes I could fix everything. Honey cried becomes honey said, sighing. Shop becomes store. Becomes Yet more becomes even more. Came in for sweets becomes came in to buy something sweet. They becomes the girls. Chapter 4. Sweets becomes candy. Heaps becomes tons. Jubilee becomes anniversary. Some of those becomes some of it. Fairy dust, too, becomes fairy dust while we're there, too. Sweets becomes candy. Sweets becomes candy. Yeah, that change is happening an awful lot in this book. What do you know? Magic you both back here becomes send you both back here with magic. Brilliant becomes fabulous. Spun sugar becomes honey. Whizzing through the air very fast becomes quickly flying through the air. Looked round becomes looked around. Glittering becomes glittery. Rachel beamed in delight becomes Rachel smiled with delight. Jolly becomes joyful. From it becomes from its towers. Smell of baking in the air becomes smell of cakes baking. Lovely becomes pretty. I suppose becomes I guess. Gorgeous becomes beautiful. Scrumptious becomes yummy. Cream sponges becomes cheesecakes. Jubilee designs becomes royal designs. Spoiled becomes ruined. Forgotten becomes forgotten that. Piped becomes squeezed. Spoiling becomes messing up. Actually becomes when actually. Quite good becomes very good. Jam tarts becomes fruit tarts. They were so pretty, Kirsty thought. It was almost a shame to eat them. Becomes they almost look too good to eat, Kirsty thought. Almost. Jam tart becomes fruit tart. Pop sweetly becomes melted. Through another huge room becomes to another huge room. Fairy lights becomes lights. In midair becomes in the air. Fluttered about becomes fluttered around. In a heart shape becomes in the shape of a heart. And then followed becomes then followed. A magnificent hallway becomes a grand ballroom. We saw this bit becomes we saw this room. Came to see us becomes visited us. It was wonderful to see becomes the girls couldn't help but smile to see. Smartly dressed in red waistcoats becomes dressed in fancy red vests. And all the wrong places becomes at all the wrong times. Through Happy Jubilee becomes in Happy Anniversary. The sentence starting with "you could say that" is split into two sentences at the word "and," which is removed. Sweet shop becomes candy shop. Chuckled becomes giggled. Those wretched goblins becomes those tricky goblins. You'd better becomes you should. Magical sweets becomes magic candy. Kirsty breathed becomes Kirsty replied. Caught up in the gale becomes caught up in the rush of air. The word to is moved to the end of the sentence. Sweet factory becomes candy factory. Chapter 5. Wrapping up gifts becomes wrapping gifts. Looping ribbons becomes silky ribbons. She marveled becomes she asked in awe. Breeze swept becomes breeze pushed. Glittering material becomes glittering fabric. That kept changing shape is removed from buttons that kept changing shape. Cheery becomes cheerful. She gasped and jumped becomes she jumped. Parcel becomes package. That was zooming becomes as it zoomed. From ceiling to floor becomes around the room. Parcel becomes present. Fun becomes what fun. Yelped becomes shrieked. Parcel becomes package. Giggling fairies becomes laughing fairies. In pursuit becomes who are chasing the present. Towards becomes toward. Sweet factory becomes candy factory. Proudly is removed from she announced proudly. Just as suddenly as it had appeared is moved to after the word away. Wind died becomes when went away. The sentence starting with just as suddenly is split into two sentences at the word and, which becomes when it did. Set gently down becomes gently set down. The word immediately is removed. Tasted deliciously of lime juice becomes tasted like sweet tangy limes. Pear drops becomes caramel apples. The illustration wasn't changed. Those are clearly pears, not apples. Sherbet lemons becomes lemon drops. Sweets becomes treats. Further becomes farther. Great lengths becomes long strips. Skipping ropes becomes jump ropes. It's becomes the licorice is. Makes becomes always makes. Skipping rope becomes jump ropes. Icing sugar becomes icing. Candy floss becomes cotton candy. Sugar mice becomes chocolate mice. Ran about becomes ran around. Filled up becomes filled. Frothing sherbet fountain becomes bubbly sugar fountain. Sweets becomes candy. Murmured becomes mumbled. Toffees becomes toffee. In the illustration, lemon lollies becomes lemon pops. Mum becomes mom. It seemed becomes it seemed like. Toffees becomes toffee. On top of becomes at the top of. Rachel beamed becomes Rachel exclaimed, looking at all the amazing candy in her hands. Leaving party becomes party for her last day. Chapter 6. The girls were fully laden becomes the girls' arms were full. The sentence starting with she waved her wand is split into two sentences at the word and, which is deleted. Sweets becomes candy. Sweet shop becomes candy store. Breathlessly becomes out of breath. The sentence starting with I'll jest is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Sort this mess becomes clean up this mess. She drew becomes she pulled. Jelly snakes becomes gummy worms. Gobstoppers becomes jawbreakers. The sentence starting with the gobstoppers is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Jelly babies becomes gingerbread men. Line themselves up neatly becomes lined up neatly. Mouth was hanging open becomes mouth was wide open. Tidy becomes clean up. Brilliant becomes amazing. I must becomes I have to. These gorgeous sweets becomes this fabulous candy. Jubilee becomes anniversary. Flourish becomes twirl. Through to the shop becomes through the door to the shop. You have done well becomes you can carry a lot. She peered at one of the jars becomes she gave one of the jars a long look. Buying becomes ordering. Sweets becomes treats. Mrs. Twist beamed becomes Mrs. Twist said with a smile. Handed becomes passed. Smell lovely becomes smell delicious. Their friends becomes their magical friends. Jubilee becomes anniversary. These are the best sweets becomes this is the best candy. Pear drops becomes lemon drops. Toffees becomes toffee. Curling becomes curly. Kirsty breathed becomes Kirsty said. Shop becomes store. Well is removed from well that was. Certainly is removed from that was certainly. Jubilee becomes anniversary. Parcel becomes present. Final pear drop becomes lemon drop. That is 303 changes for a 65-page book, making an average of 4.66 changes per page.